d4, d5, c4, e6. Knight c3, Queen's Gambit, declined, opening line. Bishop e7, Queen's Gambit, declined, Charousek Petrosian variation, opening line. Bishop f4, out of opening book, c takes d5, would have been in the Queen's Gambit, declined, Charousek Petrosian variation, book opening. Knight f6, enables the short castle. e3, protects white's pawn at c4. Castle kingside. Rook c1. Knight b d7. c5. Knight e4, blocks white's pawn at e3. Bishop d3. f5. Knight f3, enables the short castle. c6, slightly better is g5. Knight e5, blocks black's pawn at e6. Knight takes e5. Bishop takes e5, blocks black's pawn at e6. Bishop f6. Bishop takes f6, threatens black's queen. Queen takes f6. Black wins a bishop and a knight. For a bishop and a knight, material is even. Knight e2. e5. Queen a4. Queen h4, pins white's pawn at f2. g3, releases white's pawn at f2 from the pin and threatens black's queen. Queen g4, moves it to safety and blocks white's pawn at g3. Rook f1. Knight g5, pins white's pawn at d4. King d2, slightly better is Knight g1. Knight f3, check, removes the threat on black's pawn at e5, forks white's pawn at h2 and white's king and blocks white's pawn at f2. King c3, moves it out of check. Knight takes h2, threatens white's rook at f1. Black wins a pawn. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. Rook h1, moves it to safety and attacks black's knight. Knight f3, moves it to safety, removes the threat on black's pawn at e5 and blocks white's pawn at f2. Queen a5, frees white's pawn at d4 from the pin. Queen g5. D takes e5, creates a passed pawn on e5. White wins a pawn. Material is even. Queen e7. Knight d4, attacks black's knight and blocks black's pawn at d5. Knight takes e5. Black wins a pawn. Black is up a pawn. b3, slightly better is King d2. b6, threatens white's queen. C takes b6, pins black's pawn at a7 with a partial pin, removes the threat on white's queen and isolates black's pawn at a7. White wins a pawn. Material is even. c5, attacks white's knight. Knight b5. Slightly better is b7. Bishop b7 disengages the pin on black's pawn at a7 and blocks white's pawn at b6. B takes a7. Slightly better is bishop b1. d4 check forks white's rook at h1 and white's king. E takes d4. Removes the threat on white's king, threatens black's knight, and isolates black's pawn at c5. Knight takes d3. Forks white's pawn at f2 and white's rook at c1. King takes d3. Protects white's pawn at f2 and white's rook at c1. Bishop takes h1. Rook takes c5. Creates passed pawns on d4 and b3. Black wins a rook and a bishop for a knight and 3 pawns. Queen e4 check. Checks white's king. King c4. Moves it out of check. Queen e2 check. Forks white's pawn at f2 and white's king. King b4. Moves it out of check. Queen d2 check. Skewers white's king and checks white's king. Rook c3. Protects white's king. Bishop c6. a4. Pushes the passed pawn. Bishop takes b5. Attacks white's pawn at d4. King takes b5. Frees white's rook from the pin. Queen takes d4. Black wins a knight and a pawn for a bishop. Rook c7 leads to rook a b8 check. A takes b8. Queen rook takes b8 check. King c6. Queen f6 check. King d5. Rook d8 check. King c4. Queen e6 check. King b4. Queen e1 check. Rook c3. Rook d4 check. King b5. Rook d5 check. King b4. Rook takes a5. King takes a5. Queen takes c3 check. b4. Better is queen c7 leading to rook takes a7. Queen c4 check. Queen takes c4 check. King takes c4. Rook b8. Rook f3 g6. Rook e3. Rook c7 check. King d4. Rook d8 check. King e5. Rook a7. Rook c3, which gains a queen and a rook and loses 2 rooks by comparison. Rook f d8 leads to queen b6. Rook d5 check. Rook c5. Queen d3 check. King b4. Queen e4 check. King a3. Queen e7. b4. Rook takes c5. Queen takes c5. Queen takes c5. B takes c5. Rook takes a7. c6. Better is rook a b8 check leading to a takes b8. Queen rook takes b8 check. King c6. Queen f6 check. King d5. Rook d8 check. King c4. Queen e6 check. King b4. Queen e1 check. Rook c3. Rook d4 check. King b5. Rook d5 check. King b4. Rook takes a5. King takes a5. Queen takes c3 check. b4, which gains a queen and loses a rook by comparison. Black's only meaningful error of the game gave away a 1 position, but White ended up resigning anyway. Queen b6 removes the threat on White's pawn at f2. Rook d5 check, checks White's king. King a6 leads to rook d6, a5, rook takes b6, check, a takes b6, queen takes f2, rook c6, rook e8, rook c3, queen e2, check, rook c4, queen a2, check, king b7, queen g2, check, king a6, queen takes g3, rook b4, which wins a rook for a queen and 2 pawns. Better is rook c5 leading to queen d3 check, king b4, queen e4 check, king a3, queen e7, b4, rook takes c5, queen takes c5, queen takes c5, b takes c5, rook takes a7, c6, king f7, which wins a queen and a rook for a queen, a rook, and a pawn. This was White's key blunder. White was never able to recover, and eventually resigned. Rook d6 threatens checkmate, queen captures queen, pins White's queen with a partial pin, and attacks White's queen. a5 advances the passed pawn. Queen d3 check, checks White's king. King b7 moves it out of check and attacks Black's rook at a8. Queen d5 check removes the threat on Black's rook at a8 and checks White's king. White resigns.